One winter's evening, towards the close of the year 1800, I, as a young medical practitioner recently established in business, was seated by a cheerful fire in my little parlour, listening to the wind which was beating the rain in pattering drops against the window or rumbling dismally in the chimney. The night was wet and cold. I had been walking through mud and water the whole day, and was now comfortably reposing in my dressing gown and slippers, more than half asleep and less than half awake. Then I began to wonder when my first patient would appear, or whether I was destined by a special dispensation of Providence never to have any patients at all. And then I dropped to sleep and dreamed, till a voice sounded in my ears, and a hand rested on my shoulder. There was a hand upon my shoulder, its owner being a mute, corpulent, round-headed boy, Tom, who, in consideration of the sum of 1 shilling per week and his food, was let out by the parish to carry medicine and messages. As there was no demand for the medicine, however, and no necessity for the messages, he usually occupied his unemployed hours in abstracting peppermint drops, taking animal nourishment, and going to sleep. He had interrupted my sleep to indicate to me that there was someone at the door. I looked towards the glass door leading into the surgery, and started myself for an instant on beholding the appearance of my unlooked-for visitor. It was a singularly tall woman, dressed in deep mourning and standing so close to the door that her face almost touched the glass. The upper part of her figure was carefully muffled in a black shawl, as if for the purpose of concealment, and her face was shrouded by a thick black veil. She stood perfectly erect. Her figure was drawn up to its full height, and though I felt that the eyes beneath the veil were fixed on me, she stood perfectly motionless, and evinced by no gesture whatever the slightest consciousness of my having turned towards her. "Do you wish to consult me?" She slightly inclined her head in token of acquiescence. "Pray walk in." The figure moved a step forward, and then, turning its head in the direction of the boy, to his infinite horror, appeared to hesitate. "Leave the room, Tom. Draw the curtain and shut the door." The boy drew a green curtain across the glass part of the door, retired into the surgery, and closed the door after him. I drew a chair to the fire and motioned the visitor to a seat. The mysterious figure slowly moved towards it. As the blaze shone upon the black dress, I observed that the bottom of it was saturated with mud and rain. "You are very wet."
I am.
"And you are ill?"
I am very ill. Not bodily, but mentally. It is not for myself or on my own behalf that I come to you. If I laboured under bodily disease, I should not be out alone at such an hour, or on such a night as this. And if I were afflicted with it 24 hours hence, God knows how gladly I would lie down and pray to die. It is for another that I beseech your aid, sir. I may be mad to ask it for him. I think I am. But night after night, through the long dreary hours of watching and weeping, the thought has been ever present to my mind. And though even I see the hopelessness of human assistance availing him, the bare thought of laying him in his grave without it makes my blood run cold."
And a shudder, such as I well knew art could not produce, trembled through the speaker's frame. There was a desperate earnestness in this woman's manner that went to my heart. Being young in my profession, I had not yet witnessed enough of the miseries which are daily presented before the eyes of its members to have grown comparatively callous to human suffering. If the person of whom you speak be in so hopeless a condition as you describe, not a moment is to be lost. I will go with you instantly. Why did you not obtain medical advice before?"
"Because it would have been useless before. Because it is useless even now."
I gazed for a moment on the black veil, as if to ascertain the expression of the features beneath it. Its thickness, however, rendered such a result impossible. You are ill, although you do not know it. The fever which has enabled you to bear without feeling it the fatigue you have evidently undergone is burning within you now. I poured a glass of water. Put that to your lips. Compose yourself for a few moments, and then tell me as calmly as you can what the disease of the patient is, and how long he has been ill. When I know what it is necessary I should know to render my visit serviceable to him, I am ready to accompany you. The stranger lifted the glass of water to her mouth without raising the veil, put it down again untasted, and burst into tears.
I know what I say to you now seems like the ravings of a fever. I have been told so before, less kindly than by you. I am not a young woman, and they do say that as life steals on towards its final close, the last short remnant, worthless as it may seem to all beside, is dearer to its possessor than all the years that have gone before. My natural term of life cannot be many years longer, and should be dear on that account. But I would lay it down without a sigh, with cheerfulness, with joy, if what I tell you now were only false or imaginary. Tomorrow morning he of whom I speak will be, I know, though I would fain think otherwise, beyond the reach of human aid. And yet tonight, though he is in deadly peril, you must not see and could not serve him.
I am unwilling to increase your distress by making any comment on what you have just said, or appearing desirous to investigate a subject you are so anxious to conceal. But there is an inconsistency in your statement which I cannot reconcile with probability. This person is dying tonight, and I cannot see him when my assistance might possibly avail. You apprehend it will be useless tomorrow, and yet you would have me see him then. If he be indeed as dear to you as your words and manner would imply, why not try to save his life before delay in the progress of his disease render it impracticable?
God help me! How can I hope strangers will believe what appears incredible even to myself? You will not see him then, sir?
I did not say that I declined to see him, but I warn you that if you persist in this extraordinary procrastination and the individual dies, a fearful responsibility rests with you.
The responsibility will rest heavily somewhere. Whatever responsibility rests with me, I am content to bear and ready to answer.
As I incur none by acceding to your request, I will see him in the morning, if you leave me the address. At what hour can he be seen?
9.
You must excuse my pressing these inquiries, but is he in your charge now?
He is not.
Then if I gave you instructions for his treatment through the night, you could not assist him.
I could not.
Finding that there was but little prospect of obtaining more information by prolonging the interview, and anxious to spare the woman's feelings, which, subdued at first by a violent effort, were now irrepressible and most painful to witness, I repeated my promise of calling in the morning at the appointed hour. My visitor, after giving me a direction to an obscure part of Walworth, left the house in the same mysterious manner in which she had entered it. It will be readily believed that so extraordinary a visit produced a considerable impression on my mind. I had often heard of instances in which a presentiment of death had been entertained and realized. At one moment I was inclined to think that this might be such a case, but then all the anecdotes I had ever heard were of persons who had been troubled with the foreboding of their own death. This woman, however, spoke of another person, a man, and it was impossible to suppose that a mere dream or delusion of fancy could induce her to speak of his approaching dissolution with such terrible certainty as she had spoken. Then my original impression that the woman's intellects were disordered recurred. I obstinately made up my mind to believe that she was mad. Certain misgivings upon this point, however, stole upon my thoughts at the time, and presented themselves again and again through the long, dull course of a sleepless night, during which, in spite of all my efforts to the contrary, I was unable to banish the black veil from my disturbed imagination. The back part of Walworth, at its greatest distance from town, is a straggling, miserable place enough, even in these days. But 35 years ago the greater portion of it was little better than a dreary waste, inhabited by a few scattered people of questionable character, whose poverty prevented their living in any better neighbourhood, or whose pursuits and mode of life rendered its solitude desirable. The appearance of the place through which I walked in the morning was not calculated to raise my spirits. Striking off from the high road, my way lay across a marshy common, with here and there a ruinous and dismantled cottage, fast falling to pieces with decay and neglect. Now and then a miserable patch of garden ground with old palings imperfectly mended with stakes pilfered from the neighbouring hedges bore testimony at once to the poverty of the inhabitants and the little scruple they entertained in appropriating the property of other people to their own use. Occasionally a filthy-looking woman would make her appearance from the door of a dirty house to empty the contents of some cooking utensil into the gutter in front, or to scream after a little slipshod girl who had contrived to stagger a few yards from the door under the weight of a sallow infant almost as big as herself. After plodding wearily through the mud and mire, making many inquiries for the place to which I had been directed, and receiving as many contradictory and unsatisfactory replies in return, I at length arrived before the object of my destination. It was a small, low building, with even a more desolate and unpromising exterior than any I had yet passed. An old yellow curtain was closely drawn across the window upstairs, and the parlour shutters were closed, but not fastened. When I say that I hesitated and walked a few paces beyond the house before I could prevail upon myself to lift the knocker, you need to know that the police of London were a very different body in that day. The isolated position of the suburbs rendered many of them, and this in particular, a place of resort for the worst and most depraved characters. The lighting of such places as these was left entirely to the mercy of the moon and stars. The chances of detecting desperate characters, or of tracing them to their haunts, were thus rendered very few. Added to these considerations, it must be remembered that I had spent some time in the public hospitals of the metropolis, and although neither Burke nor Bishop had then gained a horrible notoriety, my own observation might have suggested to me how easily the atrocities to which the former had since given his name might be committed. Be this as it may, whatever reflection made me hesitate, I did hesitate, but it was only for an instant, and I stepped briskly back and knocked gently at the door. A low whispering was audible immediately afterwards, as if some person at the end of the passage were conversing stealthily with another on the landing above. It was succeeded by the noise of a pair of heavy boots upon the bare floor. The door chain was softly unfastened, the door opened, and a tall, ill-favoured man with black hair and a face as pale and haggard as the countenance of any dead man I ever saw presented himself. "Walk in, sir." I did so. The man secured the door again by the chain, and led the way to a small back parlour at the extremity of the passage. "Am I in time?" "Too soon." I turned hastily round, with a gesture of astonishment not unmixed with alarm, which I found it impossible to repress. If you'll step in here, sir, you won't be detained 5 minutes, I assure you." I at once walked into the room. The man closed the door and left me alone. It was a cold little room, with no other furniture than 2 deal chairs and a table of the same material. A handful of fire, unguarded by any fender, was burning in the grate, which brought out the damp if it served no more comfortable purpose, for the unwholesome moisture was stealing down the walls in long, slug-like tracks. Not a sound was to be heard, either within the house or without. I sat down by the fireplace to await the result of my first professional visit. I had not remained in this position many minutes when the noise of some approaching vehicle struck my ear. It stopped. The street door was opened. A low talking succeeded, accompanied with a shuffling noise of footsteps along the passage and on the stairs, as if 2 or 3 men were engaged in carrying some heavy body to the room above. The creaking of the stairs a few seconds afterwards announced that the newcomers, having completed their task, whatever it was, were leaving the house. The door was again closed, and the former silence was restored. Another 5 minutes had elapsed, and I had resolved to explore the house in search of someone to whom I might make my errand known, when the door opened, and my last night's visitor, dressed in exactly the same manner, with the veil lowered as before, motioned me to advance. The singular height of her form, coupled with the circumstance of her not speaking, caused the idea to pass across my brain for an instant that it might be a man disguised in woman's attire. The hysteric sobs which issued from beneath the veil, and the convulsive attitude of grief of the whole figure, however, at once exposed the absurdity of the suspicion, and I hastily followed. The woman led the way upstairs to the front room, and paused at the door to let me enter first. It was scantily furnished with an old deal box, a few chairs, and a tent bedstead without hangings or cross-rails, which was covered with a patchwork counterpane. A dim light admitted through the curtain, which I had noticed from the outside, rendered the objects in the room so indistinct, and communicated to all of them so uniform a hue, that I did not at first perceive the object on which my eye at once rested, when the woman rushed frantically past me and flung herself on her knees by the bedside. Stretched upon the bed, closely enveloped in a linen wrapper, and covered with blankets, lay a human form, stiff and motionless. The head and face, which were those of a man, were uncovered, save by a bandage which passed over the head and under the chin. The eyes were closed. The left arm lay heavily across the bed, and the woman held the passive hand. I gently pushed the woman aside and took the hand in mine. "My God! The man is dead!" The woman started to her feet.
"Oh, don't say so, sir! Oh, don't say so, sir! I can't bear it. Men have been brought to life before, when unskilful people have given them up for lost, and men have died who might have been restored if proper means had been resorted to. Don't let him lie here so without one effort to save him. This very moment of life may be passing away. Do try, sir, do, for heaven's sake."
And while speaking, she hurriedly chafed first the forehead, and then the breast at the senseless form before her, and then wildly beat the cold hands, which, when she ceased to hold them, fell listlessly and heavily back on the coverlet. "It is of no use, my good woman. Undraw that curtain."
"Why?"
"Undraw that curtain."
"I darkened the room on purpose. Oh, sir, have pity on me. If it can be of no use, and he is really dead, do not expose that form to other eyes than mine."
"This man died no natural or easy death. I must see the body." With a motion so sudden that the woman hardly knew that I had slipped from beside her, I tore open the curtain, admitted the full light of day, and returned to the bedside. "There has been violence here." In the excitement of a minute before, the woman had thrown off the bonnet and veil, and now stood with her eyes fixed upon me. Her features were those of a woman about 50, who had once been handsome. Sorrow and weeping had left traces upon them which not time itself would ever have produced without their aid. Her face was deadly pale, and there was a nervous contortion of the lip, and an unnatural fire in her eye, which showed too plainly that her bodily and mental powers had nearly sunk beneath an accumulation of misery. "There has been violence here."
There has.
This man has been murdered.
Then I call God to witness he has, pitilessly, inhumanly murdered.
By whom?
Look at the butcher's marks and then ask me.
I bent over the body, which now lay full in the light of the window. The throat was swollen, and a livid mark encircled it. The truth flashed suddenly upon me. This is one of the men who were hanged this morning.
It is.
Who was he?
My son.
And she fell, senseless, at my feet. It was true. A companion, equally guilty with himself, had been acquitted for want of evidence, and this man had been executed. The history was an everyday one. The mother was a widow without friends or money, and had denied herself necessaries to bestow them on her boy. That boy, unmindful of her prayers and forgetful of the suffering she had endured for him, incessant anxiety of mind and voluntary starvation of body, had plunged into a career of dissipation and crime, and this was the result: his own death by the hangman's hands, and his mother's shame and incurable insanity. For many years after this occurrence, and when profitable and arduous activities would have led many men to forget that such a miserable being existed, I was a daily visitor at the side of the harmless mad woman, not only soothing her by my presence, but alleviating the rigour of her condition by pecuniary donations for her comfort and support. In the transient gleam of recollection and consciousness which preceded her death, a prayer for my welfare and protection, as fervent as mortal ever breathed, rose from the lips of this poor, friendless creature. That prayer flew to heaven and was heard. The blessings I was instrumental in conferring have been repaid to me 1,000-fold. But amid all the honours of rank and station which have since been heaped upon me, I can have no reminiscence more gratifying to my heart than that connected with the Black Veil.